Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm user SteelCan909, here again with another guest coming to us from the other world of podcasting with a dedicated topic that doesn't jump around between different ideas, hosts, and interviewees. So I'll go ahead and let him introduce himself, and we can go ahead and jump right on into the discussion today.
Hi there, everyone. Glad you can make a listen to this. My name is Derek Littell, and I'm the host and creator of the Hellenistic Age Podcast. For a quick kind of summation of what is excessively complicated, the Hellenistic period refers to the time frame between the conquest and death of Alexander the Great in around 323 BC until the death of the last independent Greek ruler, Cleopatra VII, who you all probably know from Julius Caesar, Mark Antony fame. And my goal is to cover pretty much everything and anything from stretching from Britain to the end of India. And it has been a work in progress these past, I think we're on 6 to 7 years right now. So time flies when you're struggling to get through everything and keep everything on a consistent scheduled pace. How about that?
Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about why pick the Hellenistic period? Because it is a time period where our already sparse sources for much of the ancient world get even sparser, and where you have not a great deal of surviving work, even though we do know there used to be more. So how can you walk us through a little bit of how did you get interested in this topic, and how did you actually get started in this as a field of research and study, as opposed to just I'm interested in what happened after Alexander the Great died?
Well, the podcast kind of started as an experiment. I would hate to say that I started by flying by the seat of my pants, but that is the truth. I always had an interest in the ancient world, particularly that of Greece and Rome. Started off with reading classical mythology books, the DK eyewitness from the study, the eyewitness to Pompeii, that sort of thing. But it wasn't until my university years that I really started picking up into classical history. I found a little, maybe podcast you might have heard of called The History of Rome. And from there, I was able to really get my love for the ancient world reinvigorated. And now I had been familiar with the primarily, classical Greece to some extent, and also that of ancient Rome. Mainly, we're thinking of the time of Julius Caesar and, bits and pieces picked up from Gladiator and the like. But the Hellenistic world was always something that was on the periphery. When you're reading the books of Livy, you suddenly encounter the Romans meeting with Greek kings that are ruling from Syria and Egypt, and that was always interesting to me. I never really knew much about them. You heard of them through tertiary media, like the Total War Rome series. And I knew also quite a bit about Alexander the Great. I listened to an excellent lecture series and decided to read about his works, or all the Alexandrian historians. And part of it was I wondered, what lies beyond that? The podcast started off as my test run was with Alexander. And after I thought it was a pretty fun exercise, I slowly but surely wanted to learn more about the Hellenistic world. And the podcast is a twofold process. I'm not only trying to cover an area that I think is immensely interesting for a wide variety of reasons, and I'm probably going to bring up as many as I can in this little discussion here, but part of it is I'm actually teaching myself as we're going along. I have no background in classical history or as a historian. Beyond biology was my undergraduate, and then I went to business school, so a bit of a winding path, but I've always had this fascination with the ancient world, with ancient philosophy, and the response I got from people was really surprising, where I personally would find this stuff very interesting. But then I've got messages where people are like, I've always looked for something about the Hellenistic world, but could never find anything accessible. And that has kind of dictated the way I produce the show and how I pick topics. Because for me, I'm learning this experience, but how do it was someone with, this is my hobby and passion. What about the person that maybe isn't as lucky to have as much time as I do? Let's find a way to digest academia and what more intensive research into something that's comprehensible and easily digested to offer a springboard for future study for people. And again, they know of this from Imperator Rome or Total War Rome or anything else of that media, video games, movies. But I like to think that this is the optional side quest if you're a fan of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, a world that's untapped and I think is really ripe for potential for study.
I gotcha. So, given that your background is not in history, and that's one of the reasons that we at Ask Historians often reach out to people, is because many of us are not actual day-to-day historians in the sense that we're not academics. For example, I have a master's degree in the medieval period, but my day job is teaching history at a high school level. I'm not doing my own research. I'm not putting out new information. I am synthesizing information for, at an appropriate level for an appropriate audience. But that's one thing that I wanted to dive into this a little bit. Where do you see yourself fitting into the broader ecosystem of history? So podcasts, we've got, there are movies, there are YouTube channels, there are all sorts of avenues that people can get into history these days. How do you see yourself in this non-historical background informing the decisions that you've made and your own choices?
Well, part of it is that from experience of I also use the podcast as a bit of like a way to flex my mental muscles when it comes to writing. I don't really have an opportunity to do it since I work primarily in sales, and this is always an exercise. It's an exercise in that, but with podcasting, it's an interesting area. Now, again, as I name dropped the Mike Duncan's The History of Rome, which I'm sure was been, if not him, then certainly Dan Carlin has inspired about 95% of the modern history podcast scene, or is a reaction to it. There are aspects where I have the time and patience and income to just say I'm going to spend money on books that are academic level books, which are often outrageous in price, but not everybody has that luxury and has the time, because when I was delving into this at first, I found it was a really tough time finding more up-to-date sources and accessible sources for topics that I think are fascinating, such as the Greek kingdoms that lived in Afghanistan and India. Very few books are available to the I guess you call it the mass market or anything like that. Media that is available to that is varying quality depending on research that could be 50 to 60 or even 100 years old, because that's the only thing that's available. So one of the things I strive for in my podcast is I try to go for an academic level standard. I'm not going to be, reinventing the wheel in a lot of cases where I'm contributing original information or original research, but I can take the information that is out there, be it in recent research papers, publications, anything and everything I can pull from, and try to bring it together in something that is cohesive and is easily accessible. Podcasts, the nice thing is most of them are free. And I like to always incorporate aspects like a bibliography, extensive annotations and transcripts as I've gone on my process, where people have reached out to me where they've asked details like that. Like, could you provide a transcript? Maybe I'm not English is not their first language. They're looking for ways to cite my writing for their own paperwork as they're starting to get more involved in it. So I think that there is a lot of potential with podcasting by virtue of the fact that it is something it's something you can take on the go. It's easily digestible and it's widely available to everyone. There are also problems with it being widely available to everyone. I mean, the average Joe can literally, well, I'm an average Joe in this case, can just get a cheap microphone, claim anything about any historical topic you want, and then put it out there for the world to consume. It's not always going to be well received, and I'm sure that it's filtered by just the abundance and inundation of information. But I like to think that I hold myself accountable, especially the last several, after the first few months, getting into that rhythm and finding out that I need to be more accountable in how I present this information, how I make it accessible, and what ways we can go about introducing people to, in a simplified manner, a very complicated subject or subjects.
And that gets into one of the topics that I wanted to talk about a little bit, where nowadays the market for public history is inundated with, for want of a better term, slop. A lot of it's AI generated, it's AI voiceover. I can't browse through YouTube these days without getting, all sorts of things popping up that have 2 views that were uploaded 5 minutes ago and are, 20-minute long videos where you can tell even from the thumbnail that this is just completely all done by generative AI technology or language learning model, however you want to parse it. Where do you see the role then of people like you who are not necessarily academics, not necessarily inside the ivory tower, but are trying to put out work that is academically credible, even if it's not individual research, breaking new ground, but trying to take that synthesis of this is the real work that's being done. This isn't just something that somebody made up, and I'm trying to present this in a cogent, digestible, and accessible manner.
I think part of it is making sure you are able. I think the biggest challenge is how to reach and engage your audience in the sense of what you mentioned with the proliferation of AI and AI content. And I believe me, when I'm browsing through YouTube recommendations, when I'm looking up a specific topic, the first few, at least, search results turn up with 3 hours of some copy and pasted, clearly not research, just taken from whatever AI generative of write me a topic about the Revolutionary War. Probably in the first 5 minutes, it's going to have 25 different points of contention. But I think that they bank too much on people just wanting to waste time. I think that the part of the reason why I found a lot of success from people that have discovered my show is there are areas where, bringing back the Greco-Bactrians, I always use this as my classical example. Most books and topics that delve on them focus on coins, on archaeological papers, because there's very few pieces of written, documented, or I guess how you call them, written primary sources to draw a dramatic narrative. I mean, someone writing a history of the Second Punic War does not really have to go far to make a dramatic narrative when you have the likes of Plutarch, Polybius, Livy, who are masters of their own craft in their own right. But trying to create these engaging and fascinating, I guess, content pieces to draw an audience in, to make them go, I'd like to learn more about this. You start them off, you wean them into the topic. You don't treat them like they're stupid, or you don't talk down to them. I find that it's always good to present them with a way to find that an easy starting point when like I want to learn. You get a topic about something. Where would I start learning? Well, listen to this 35-minute episode on the Nabateans. Here's a whole bibliography for you to draw on if you want to go further. And I make sure to specify that this is not the end all be all conversation on a topic I'm presenting. There is much more out there, but part of the role that a public, I guess, a content creator, a public historian, whatever you want to call that terminology or bridge, is it's making sure to create content as engaging, but is not dumbed down and simplified, nor I would say is twisted, or you're just trying to use content just to leverage your own talking points, be it political, or you're just trying to grift, whatever the case may be, which I've seen in abundance from the last several years of YouTube and podcasting in general. I'm not naming names in that regards, but you can easily see it as soon as you find something out there, and it's not hard. And going from controversial topics or takes that will draw your attention to, hey, here's a nuanced discussion on this topic. It's a challenge to get over that initial attention grabber. But I think that many of myself, and I like to think myself, and many of my colleagues do a good job at that. But it is a balancing act, I will admit.
Where do you draw the line then between material that can draw in people? You mentioned, for example, the Total War Rome series, where if we're going to sit here and talk about historical inaccuracies, even given your own particular area of interest, Ptolemaic Egypt is portrayed as rising out of the sands of the late New Kingdom.
I mean, you might as well throw Brendan Fraser's The Mummy in there. It'd make no difference.
And I get it. And I love that movie too. And I love the first Rome Total War. Where do you draw the line between this is bringing in people, this is creating this engagement and this connection with areas that are underappreciated, but also it's wrong. Like there's nothing accurate here. Ptolemy Philadelphos is a name that was used in Ptolemaic Egypt, and that's about where we're at.
That's a tough challenge because I will fully admit part of my love of the ancient world is drawn from movies that came out in my childhood. So Gladiator is probably a big one for many people of my generation, where you were drawn to the image of the Colosseum and the spectacle of swords and sandals that hadn't been done in almost 30 years prior to that. But Gladiator is not really accurate. Not most of Ridley Scott's productions are not accurate. 300 is even worse. But I love that movie regardless. As kind of I can't say it's so bad it's good. I just think it's enjoyable for all the many inaccuracies it has. There lies the question of, at what responsibility do filmmakers have or do media creators have to try to introduce these topics while not like totally deviating. Obviously, I think I have to give media a bit of leeway where you have to allow for a certain creative license when it comes to storytelling, even though the real story is oftentimes more dramatic than what they come up with. But there are movies that do attempt to be historically accurate in the sense of, I would actually, kind of this brings me a nice talking point. The difference between historical accuracy through what I would call historical authenticity. I think that there is an inclination for people who are fans of history to get very angry about, a movie that presents Napoleonic era is, Master and Commander. There's nothing entirely right. There's this particular aspect was wrong, et cetera, et cetera. This date didn't happen, or this event didn't happen on this date. It was actually flipped. I think that's a little bit of nitpicking. I think that historical authenticity is the extent for me, when I see something that I consider historically authentic, it's someone has clearly done the research, the time and effort to present an image of whatever time period it is, be it ancient Rome or Napoleonic France or whatever the case may be, and to draw an audience in enough to be able to, pique their fascination. A great example of when this can go backwards is Oliver Stone's Alexander from 2004, which I personally love, but is probably the most, the best representation of ancient Greek and Macedonian culture out there. But it was a huge flop and had a lot of issues with it, and is almost incomprehensible to someone who doesn't know about the story of Alexander. I can piece it together because I've read Arrian, I've read Plutarch and Quintus Curtius, but most people haven't. So there are also mediums that have done good things about this. You mentioned Total War. I mean, again, I'm sure many people have started off with maybe their first impressions of the Parthians as pink pajama-wearing archers in the first Total War. Not much better in the second game, but it is a marked improvement. That's a tough question. I like to think that if I can tell when an author clearly does, or when a director or producer clearly cares about the subject they're trying to present on screen or in games, and then is willing to admit that there are licenses taken, and then it goes in the other direction. But that's a personal line that I find people can draw. Some people you can, quote, turn your brain off and watch the movie and just enjoy for what it is. Some people will sit there and, pen and paper, just like hate a movie for every little tiny nitpicking detail. It's a fine line, unfortunately. I like to see more accuracy than not, which is why I love Alexander, but more people are going to go watch Gladiator each and every year than ever going to consider Alexander. How about that?
So given that situation where there is a desire for some of this material from the ancient world, obviously trends in media come and go. Different movies are popular at different times. You mentioned the sword and sandal genre, where you have the kind of the peak in the 50s and the 60s, and then goes away for a little bit, and then Gladiator comes roaring back. And then even then, that kind of resurgence of epic historical movie petered out after, a few years. And Ridley Scott's subsequent returns, both in the Gladiator franchise and other, it is a little painful to say the Gladiator franchise, and in other historical epics, have been more mixed. Given that tastes change both in academia and in popular culture, where do you see the role of podcasters and so on in filling in the gaps between these waves of cultural awareness?
Well, definitely when someone watches Gladiator, for example, and mention like you could type up if you want to bring up a famous movie scene, gladiators fighting tigers. Their results are always going to vary, and you'll start getting your initial access. But a lot of people like to go right to YouTube, or if you're browsing through YouTube Shorts, it's automatically recommended. Um, Content creators, the biggest channels will automatically get theirs pop up first, and you could get related videos related to gladiators in Rome, something very eye catching, not really terribly deep, but certainly something that whets their appetite for and curiosity for more and more content like this. In regards to podcasting, I think that there is a lot of potential it depends on your style. So many of my counterparts will do either, I would call it, there's really two categories. One is a long form serial style podcast where they have a set period in mind or end date or a series of topics where they're going to start at point A and end at point at Z and cover everything in between. That's what I would fall into. Mike Duncan's History of Rome, same thing. And then there are those who do varied topics every other week and are more conversational in style versus a scripted narrative that they are rigidly following, which is the case of myself. I think that being able to have diversified enough content where you can appeal to both styles, or rather, both styles can be appealed to and tastes in their respective areas. I'm sorry, I'm kind of pausing here. Could you repeat your question again? My apologies.
I could not come up with the whole phrase that I just did.
Oh, okay.
The gist of it would be, where do you see podcasts filling in between gaps of cultural awareness? Like, for example, let's take Ancient Rome. Ancient Rome comes and goes in popular consciousness. You've got Gladiator, and then shortly afterwards you have HBO's Rome, and then you've got a couple other series and movies. I remember at the same time you had movies like The Last Legion were coming out, and then it peters off and trails off, and we haven't had, up until Gladiator 2 released last year, we hadn't really had a big budget Hollywood approach to ancient Rome. We can see the same thing with the medieval period and like for Vikings and so on. The Vikings were really big in popular consciousness for a few years, and then it peters out. And so my question is, do you see podcasts as a way to kind of bridge that period of cultural spotlight?
I think so. With podcasts, by their nature, they are long form media. So even if your podcaster, your favorite podcaster has a style where they are covering a specific period, a history of X country, or the Hellenistic Age in this case, this is an ongoing process that takes months to years, especially if they're independent, where they are working by themselves. Sometimes you have podcasters that will do these individual series where they will jump from one time period to another in a series of 10 episodes that it's done in a couple of months. But I feel like podcasters that have these long form styles and serial episodes where they are covering periods like this or are continuing to focus on a particular area, the recidivism of people continuing to listen, I think, grows each and every month. When there's enough of a backlog and keeps that fire going, as it were, the passing the torch each couple of months until the next big cycle comes, where I know for exact fact that many people who were involved in doing content creation around ancient Rome, when Gladiator 2 was announced and released, that was a huge deal for them, and people are drawn to it like moths to a flame, where suddenly their search engine opposition skyrockets. It has all this engagement. People then start going and finding out more information. So podcasting also helps where it creates a backlog of accessible material, where when you have these little nodes of Hollywood and these little blurbs of that intense sword and sandal period of the early 2000s, maybe a blip here and there with the rival Gladiator or the 10th Cleopatra movie now with Gal Gadot, which I'm not looking forward to another Cleopatra story. But those kind of things help out with podcasters. But then also in turn, we then provide an avenue to the average consumer where they're able to indulge their curiosity and never really lose that interest or spark. And trying to keeping their attention is a different question, as long as you maintain your quality or you improve upon things. I'm sure my first episodes are not the greatest in hindsight compared to where I'm at now, but I think if you can act as that sort of vanguard or support for these areas that are only covered in the briefest of flashes, then I think that is better for the long-term survival of historical studies in general, where people may go into classics if they love Gladiator, or they've seen Cleopatra with Elizabeth Taylor, for example, and some people will find their love, like I did, through podcasting, and turn that into a passion project, which I will ever be forever grateful for Mike Duncan for doing this when no one else has.
When we're looking at your particular focus, because you kind of touch on this idea of creating the backlog and their specific incidents can maybe draw in more people, how does that affect your research process? Like, do you sit down and say, I want to do an episode on X, Y, or Z, both because it's coming up in the chronology and because I think it's going to be topical? Or is this is where we're at? This is it is now X year, X month, time to do this. How do you do your process in terms of this is what my next topic is?
That's a great question. From my perspective, as much there are aspects where I would love to just jump at a topic right away because I have people clamoring for it. I have just started releasing episodes on the Maccabean Revolt, and even 4 years ago, people were asking me, when am I going to get to the Maccabeans? And people are now asking me, when am I going to get to Cleopatra? I'm like, we're still only halfway done with the time period. Give me a bit of leeway here. But for myself, I am strictly following chronology from start to finish. And I think that was actually a good thing, because starting off and being able to restrain myself from jumping into topics I maybe found to be the most interesting right away allowed me to hone my skills as a writer, as a researcher, to build up that network of sources I can draw from, be it online databases, which I never knew prior to that, or there is access to specific sources or new publications that come out that totally make it much more easy to write about. Part of it is again, this is all a learning experience for me, where the broad strokes of the Hellenistic period I can pretty much nail down from start to finish and how I want to go about it. But then when I get to that point where I think the only way I can accurately predict is about a year's worth of episodes. That's about 10 to 15 in sequence of what am I planning for and how can I prepare for it. If I know I'm going to be covering a topic, I start reading about it a couple of years in advance, because it takes time to read books and I'm distracted with other things. And there is that in I guess I would call it the plight of the researcher, when you finish writing about a particular topic and you think you've done all the work, and then you look on Amazon and you find out a book that would have totally revamped the way you structured your writings, your episode format, has coming out next month. So you're already released the episode, so c'est la vie. But I think that for me, it's all foresight and planning, where I have to build it up as I'm going. But then I also leave room for not so much improvisational as much as it is spur of the moment changes, where I suddenly have, as I pull the finer details of sources, suddenly I found this whole interesting page about this topic. Like, wow, I really should be incorporating this. I had no idea this was not a part of my framework, but this literally was a development I made in the last minute of certain episodes over time. So in my case, I like to think of myself as accurately preparing research for years to come. I like to say, oh yeah, I'm reading Cicero now, so I can use it 2 or 3 years down the line. But that position I have now will change by the time I get to that episode. So it's a constant battle and a work in progress, but it is impressive where I've started from to where I am now. And it's kind of scary in hindsight, considering I wonder how much I've spent on my books and research materials.
If I've learned one thing as a history major and, focus on the Middle Ages, and then I have my own other areas of interest, you just don't ask questions about how much the book costs. You just don't think about it.
No, of course.
It's easier that way.
I absolutely need this hardcover copy of the epigraphy of Ptolemaic Egypt, Volume 1. Of course I'm going to use it right away. unlikely to be so. But we'll call that my own personal vice, and how I like to keep say the podcast is in the green or in the black rather.
When we're looking at what about some of the other topics you cover, though? So a lot of what you do is the political history, right? And if you're going to go through the Hellenistic Age from A to Z, as you say, you can't start with the Punic Wars. That's just not in the chronology. But where do you then put in things like talking about Greek philosophy or daily life in Ptolemaic Egypt or the writings of Jewish theologians and Jewish authors of the Hellenistic period, where there is a little bit more malleability in terms of where you can slot them in? How do you where do you draw the line and say, I'm talking about this now, even though there's not necessarily a reason to do it right at this very moment?
Sometimes it's pure luck, in coincidence, where you find a natural breaking point in the overall narrative after, let's say, a dramatic event like the Punic Wars or anything where you're focusing on a particular area. It just feels a right place to introduce a topic. And then, but sometimes I think it's important to give them a bit of a breather in between larger discussions where if I am talking about the dealings of Ptolemaic Egypt for about 4 or 5 months, let's pivot and start talking about the societal aspects or Hellenistic philosophy, as you mentioned, because I think that it is important to be comprehensive. Because it's not just political history. That's where I think what I really wanted to deviate and I guess improve upon compared to earlier podcasters who do the strict political narrative from A to Z. I wanted to make sure it's a comprehensive look at this time period across all areas. And that's actually where I come up with these weird digressions where I do have a primary narrative of sorts, and I have to weave together several different major powers into something that's cohesive. Whereas some people maybe have just a single country they're trying to follow. I have to balance people in Greece and people in Central Asia and people in or North Africa. That's a big challenge. And there are areas where they kind of flow naturally together, but being able to link it all together in a cohesive manner without simply retreading the same ground is a big challenge, and something I do pride myself when I'm able to successfully segue into it, where that can sometimes come at the cost of maybe finding a more relevant time to do it. Um, I probably would get a much stronger reaction of releasing the Maccabees episodes around the time of Hanukkah in December, but it's middle of July. I got to release it now and talk about the Hanukkah story halfway through the year comparatively. But delving into those other topics that outside of the the deeds of kings and queens and the sufferings of the little person, I really like to be able to illustrate what these events have an impact on, and also vice versa, see how the wider changes of society, be it economic, cultural, religious, how they impact the larger narrative, and then try to call those back when I can. And building upon those points where everything is supposed to be leading into another, as we're going along from a chronological serial net framework. Why did the events of the First Punic War affect the Second Punic War? What else did it lead a consequence to? And be able to draw upon that for my listeners, and then incorporate other aspects. We talked about the economy in this case. Here you go. Let's bring it back as to what changes were going on. We mentioned in some previous episode. Here's where it's manifesting. So I don't think that I think there's sometimes it may come out of left field. It's like, well, you're going from talking about Greek rulers in India to now you're talking about the poems of Theocritus. Like, where does that come from? But I think that there is a good way to make it almost episodic in nature, where people can get these breathers and they're mentally preparing themselves for the next round of keeping track of dates, names, events, as opposed to and missing the finer points of what matters as well about this time period.
When you're looking at the Hellenistic age in particular and these different digressions from whether it's like you said, the narratives of kings, generals, the military, political element, where do you see the geographic boundary of what you're looking at in the podcast? Because if you're thinking Hellenistic, Hellen coming from Greek, referring to the Greeks, yet you do have these digressions into a little bit of Jewish history. You've got Carthaginian history. You've got obviously Roman history. And I guess the question is then twofold. One, do you see your interest in this area expanding as you go? For example, I'm going to have to start talking about the Gauls in a little bit. So it's time to start figuring out what we know about the Gallic peoples who, and their spread around Europe. Or is it the Hellenistic world is shrinking as Rome starts to gobble up the various kingdoms, and then you have the Seleucids go into decline and so on until you're at the very, very end? How do you see the geographic boundaries of your area shifting over the course of your research?
Well, and for context, for many people who may not be aware, with the Hellenistic world, primarily you're focusing on three big powers: that of the Antigonid Kingdom in Macedonia and the rest of mainland Greece. Then you have the Seleucid Empire, which is from the Bosphorus all the way to what is now Afghanistan, and then Ptolemaic Egypt, which covers the lands of Egypt, parts of North Africa, and even as far south as the Aswan and in the Sudan. Now, that's a large area to cover, and that doesn't even include the other tertiary powers, that of the Roman Republic, the Carthaginians, Mauryan Empire of India. So, I found that one of the things also I wanted to change about the format is I can't just follow the big three, as it were. I wanted to be able to contextualize what their position is in the wider scale of the classical world, from the shores of Britain to the south of Gujarat. This was an area that was interconnected by economic trade, by military, by warfare. These are oftentimes far apart, and when you look at it on the map, you really can't believe that this is actually what's affecting in Afghanistan would eventually lead to changes with the Senate in Rome, people in Rome and Italy. But I think that it is important because they all had interactions with one another, and some of my biggest hits have been covering these peoples and civilizations that are often neglected in favor of the traditional focused narrative of the Greeks and Romans. Be they the Arya-Raphids of Cappadocia, the Mauryan emperor rulers of India. They are. I think that what I want to do is to be able to piece together this wide world and give context as to, okay, well, we are focusing on the deeds of the Seleucids, Ptolemies, but what about these peoples that they did encounter with, that they competed with, that they cooperated with, whatever the case may be. And I think that gives a richer picture of not only the ancient world as a concept, because it is more than just the Greeks and Romans, but it also does give a reflection back as to how do we compare and contrast them with how do we compare and contrast the Meroitic Kingdom of Nubia with their neighbors Ptolemaic Egypt? What were the policies between each other? How would they influence each other? How do their economies intertwine? I think that. Oh, did I lose you? Away with that of Ptolemaic Egypt, their rivals and neighbors to the north. I think it is important to not neglect these, we'll call them smaller or minor entities, because they do enrich our understanding of the Hellenistic world. Because even though the Macedonian kings and then later the Roman Republic or the Parthians are the dominant powers, they are not the only powers. And they are also affected by the changes that are going on in other parts of the Mediterranean and of the Near East, Central Asia, Africa. And that to me has been very important. And that's actually where I've gotten a lot of positive responses, where people have been asking, I've always wanted to learn more about the Orontids of Armenia, but I didn't know where to begin. So that to me became part of the mission. And I found that I've been immensely fascinated by it, where I had never understood anything about, for example, the emperors of India, of the Mauryan dynasty. But then you have someone like Asoka, who is a Indian emperor who renounces violence after committing terrible atrocities in a military conquest, apparently converts to Buddhism, expresses rock carvings that are written in Aramaic and Greek in Afghanistan, and then sends messengers and Buddhist proselytizers all the way to places as far as Libya. I had no concept of this prior to beginning this project, but then you just kind of get filtered through it. And by osmosis, this has passed along, and I've been able to draw more people into those areas that they may otherwise have not considered before, but for their interactions with the Hellenistic kingdoms or the fact that we're bringing it to the forefront anyways.
I see. So then, kind of building on that, how do you see yourself going forwards in, as you start covering more topics? Where you mentioned the big three Hellenistic powers, and now, at least at the point of recording, you're down to two big Hellenistic powers after the Antigonids poke the Roman eagle one too many times, and now that you're getting into a period of history where the Hellenistic monarchies are on the way down, right? Where after you get past the first few Ptolemaic kings, for example, it's a pretty sad list of what they're able to accomplish. Or you see the Seleucids and their empire breaking off. Do you see yourself transitioning into covering more, for example, of Meroe or the Armenian kingdom? Or do you see yourself becoming more, okay, Rome is starting to take over the Hellenistic world, so now we have to start becoming a history of Rome, but through a Hellenistic angle?
Columns A and B in this case. Now, as per the inevitability of our sources, Cleopatra may be perhaps the most famous woman of antiquity, but she's largely defined by her interactions with powerful Roman men, Caesar, Antony, and then later Augustus for the briefest of periods, much to her eventual death. This is a natural byproduct where they are becoming more intertwined with the affairs of the Roman Republic and trying to view their histories through that lens of the rolling tide of Roman conquest, or if you want to go in the other direction, that of the Parthians. I am shrinking their scope of those particular dynasties where the Syrian or the Seleucids are eventually restricted to Syria, where they fight civil wars for about 30, 40 years before ultimately being absorbed into that of Rome after Pompey encounters them. But at the same token, I am also continuing to expand for maybe those, I guess, in the vacuum of these Hellenistic kingdoms that are shrinking or being kicked out by other states. You then have the rise of these many different nations and entities that otherwise were just minor footnotes in their larger Hellenistic context. Perhaps the most famous example is Mithridates of Pontus, the Poison King, as some maybe call him. He goes from ruling a small little city-state kingdom at the base of the Black Sea to becoming a huge threat to Rome in under 30, 40 years. And then there are these other players that will step in to fill the void and rise up and start taking back independence, be it the Frateraka of Persis, who then reassert their claims to the fallen Achaemenid Empire, the development of the Hasmonean kingdom, which manages to gain independence, and Judea and the Jews at large are able to be independent for the first time since the fall of Jerusalem 600 years earlier. Not quite 600 years earlier, but that the point is made. I think that it is important to still bring them in because these kingdoms also are to some extent reactions to those declining Hellenistic powers and inherit a lot of their systems where they are ruling those former lands and have to make changes accordingly. They are now finding themselves in a new imperial framework, especially pertaining to the Near East, where you have the rise of the Roman Empire controlling the Mediterranean and that of Parthia controlling much of the Iranian plateau and the Middle East. And this is a new framework, and I think it's essential to telling why the end of the Hellenistic world happened the way it did. So no, I think that it's, while I am going to be framing maybe that traditional narrative in a bit more of a smaller context when it comes to the main kingdoms, that my geography remains untouched, and I'm still going to be covering pretty much everything that goes on until Cleopatra breathed her last, and even maybe a further beyond, depending on how it goes.
Given the clear overall arc of what you're looking at, you've got Alexander dies, events happen, Cleopatra dies, Cleopatra, to be precise, Cleopatra the Seventh, et cetera, et cetera. When you're looking at that kind of overarching scope of the Hellenistic period, do you think that your focus on that kind of cycle that you mentioned, where you've got that period of political, military events, and then step aside, let's look at daily life, let's look at religion, let's look at science, let's look at philosophy, etc. Do you see that same kind of cycle being repeated as you get closer to, was it 44, 43 BC? Or no, it's a little bit later than that. That's when Caesar's killed. Not important. When you get to that kind of the end point, because not to say that your kind of whole project is teleological, but there is a teleos at the end of it, right? The Hellenistic period comes to an end. I mean, obviously, we can talk more metaphysical than that, talk about Greek influences on Roman life and so on, but that's maybe a little bit too abstract. Do you see that same kind of cycle of, as we've described, continuing as you continue to go forward?
Yes, in many ways, yeah. In many ways, that is going to be the case. When looking at how the collapse of, I mean, again, if we want to talk teleological, the decline and fall of the Hellenistic world is what I'm trying to avoid, because it's dependent on the Hellenistic kingdoms would always have fallen, But my more question is, okay, let's give context. Why did they collapse? Possible reasons for doing so. What are the ramifications of said collapse? What were the legacies that they did had? You mentioned, what are the impacts of Greek culture on Rome? Now, part of that, I guess, part of kind of spoilers for my show, is part of the final episodes I'm going to be addressing is, what was that ultimate impact? And in some ways, I kind of leave it as a bit of a paradox where then the Hellenistic period is over in a bookend sense. It's a nice way to bookend it with the death of Cleopatra and the absorption of Egypt into the Roman Empire. But then you can ask the question, is the Roman Empire a Hellenistic kingdom or Hellenistic state or successor? In many ways it is. And same with the Parthians and that of the Kushans, who have taken over from the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms and Indo-Greek kingdoms in Central Asia and India. So that cycle of going between narrative and non-narrative focus, it's going to be, I'd say, less so in some sense, where it is important. I can give more context as to what was life like for the average average Egyptian under Ptolemaic rule. Pretty much at the height of their power, you have more documentation, more information, whereas when you start declining, you then lose that documentation. And I think it's more relevant to discuss at that time. But these are always things that are going to pop up in the narrative itself when there is less to go on. And I always think it's important to bring in as many topics where, you talk about let's say the declining years of the Ptolemies. Well, let's bring up this experience of a specific cavalryman whose letters have survived on papyri fragments, and what does this reveal about the state of Egypt that lends to this overall story? That is going to be more of the aspect, is integrating it into that narrative, or intertwining it with my narrative rather than setting it aside for a separate discussion, because I think it's inevitable. You cannot escape that with how little or how much less sources there are for the ancient world and for the Hellenistic kingdoms in general. So I don't think it's going to go away, but it's going to be transformed in a different style. But that base element is always going to be there.
What are some of the elements of Hellenistic history that you knew going into were going to be things you wanted to spend some time with and were interested in learning more about and unpacking, compared to what were some things that you had no idea that you would be interested in?
I think perhaps the most, attention grabbing, and I've alluded to them several times by virtue, are the Greek kingdoms of Central Asia and India, the Greco-Bactrian and the Indo-Greeks, as they're often named in academic circles and general popular perception. When you're presented with something as, I guess I would, for lack of a better phrase, exotic sounding as an Athens in Afghanistan, that just evokes a certain level of of mystique and intrigue. But that in itself is fascinating, and that's something I really wanted to learn more about. Was finding out how deep the interactions went between the Mediterranean world with that of South Asia and Central Asia, where they're perceived in a typical framework, they're a periphery at best, or they're on the edge of the world, of the ancient world, in the framework of most lecture series or anything like that. But one thing I found interesting about that is it did reveal, studying the Greco-Bactrian and the Greeks, is that we have so little information about them from written sources that we have to rely on aspects that are maybe a little bit more unorthodox for someone not initiated, namely the study of numismatics, coinage, and how they were constructed, how they were destroyed or hidden away, or whatever the case may be. Anything and everything to do with coinage. That was an area I had no information about. And I was thinking this is going to be a pretty dry exercise as I'm trying to compare the designs of coins and the weights and metals and whatnot. But then you encounter some authors and scholars who manage to turn something that sounds, I hate to be disparaging, but sounds boring, as let's talk about pieces of metal and see what we can learn from them, to someone like Professor Frank Lee Holt, who wrote an amazing series of books on numismatics and the study of coinage, to make it so utterly fascinating and surprisingly engaging. So many aspects of the Hellenistic world where I had no information on. You get surprised whenever you come across where, let me think. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this all. Sorry, I'm just trying to come up here. You have obviously your big grand moments, which are those like the taglines you want to put on the back of a book, the Second Punic War, war elephants, Pyrrhus of Epirus, even like the Maccabees is a great one. That's probably the most well known to the general public, if outside of maybe a few other pieces. But when you delve into these areas that require you to do a bit more deep dives on, I think I find myself learning something new every day, and I'm actually amazed at how much I continue to learn, even after reading a dozen books about roughly the same topic. There's always some little way that I found it to be presented to me in a way that is exceptionally gripping and engaging, and wanting me to learn more. I've been doing this for several years now, and my love and passion for it has never waned. And every time I delve into something that's a little bit new, a little bit unique, that just rekindles that spark more. Right now, we're getting into the the decline of these major kingdoms and the rise of these smaller entities that I have no idea about. Being, for example, the kingdom of Commagene, where you have King Antiochus Theos, who has these enormous monuments in Turkey of him shaking the hands of Heracles, putting his horoscope on there, and we know just stuff like this just draws me in ever more, and it's something I want to share with my listeners in any way that I can. I don't know if it's always going to be very successful, but I like to think that I'm always going to be having a passion for this era, and there's always going to be things that are always going to be drawing me in. Sorry if that was a terrible answer to the question.
No. Well, part of the wonder of like podcast interviews is you get to kind of untangle other elements that kind of build off of the original question. I think that's great. When you are looking at all these different books and these different scholars who are putting together this information, do you feel yourself influenced by particular schools of thought? And I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit, who are some of the major scholarly influences on what you're presenting, and who are some of the big influences on how you've been doing the podcast? You've mentioned Mike Duncan a few times, and you've mentioned at other times you have you said like colleagues kind of in the podcasting, this world of making this information accessible, who would you say are some of the major influences on both your academic, the academic information that you're presenting and in the way that you present it?
Starting from the first part, there are probably the book that inspired me the most to begin the podcast was the Alexander to Actium by Peter Green, who has actually passed away earlier this year, I believe. Um, this is a 900-page tome. It's absolutely massive, and that was my first attempt to learn more about the Hellenistic period, and I could not get through it, not because of the actual quality of writing, which is, people have found to be extremely engaging. I just was overwhelmed with the information. But looking back now, it was a direct inspiration, and I've referred to Green's book back and forth as kind of like a checkpoint as to, how does what I've done in research compared to what his final stamp was, because it's that book in particular has dictated a lot of the traditional perception of the Hellenistic period since it was published in 1990. But particular authors and schools of thought, I mentioned previously Frank Lee Holt, who does an amazing job with getting me interested in numismatics and the many ways that coins can tell a story. The fact that the way he articulated the idea of coins that rather than just being just things you find in the ground and you pay for things, they are compact, nearly indestructible discs of information that are the first forms of mass communication in human history. Produced by the millions, they communicate everything, not just the fact that they distribute the names of rulers and maybe some fluffing of their egos through epithets and the like, but the very creation and the flaws in their creation can tell stories, where they've been found, how they've been arranged, who's overstriking who, the weights and measures, and how that relates to the economy. Those are aspects he's managed to capture, and I've always tried to incorporate coinage talk to some extent by virtue of the fact that it is such an integral part of adding detail to a story that is a little bit sparse in areas, and that's sometimes the only resource we have. Other important influences is Rachel Mayers, who is a historian or is a Hellenistic scholar who has covered a couple of different topics, both Ptolemaic Egypt and Central Asia, where she does talk about the nature of identity. One of the big questions and perceptions of this period is the interaction of Greek and non-Greek cultures, be it Greek and Jewish, Egyptian, Babylonian, Indian, Central Asian. But the question is scholars are prone to historically, and I am no less guilty of this sometimes, is looking for evidence of Greekness. We're looking for how did the Greeks influence this area? Oh, this person has a Greek name, or they have a Greek object. This must mean there were Greeks here. But Rachel Mayers does a great job at illustrating that identity is exceptionally complicated. Just because someone has a Greek name doesn't make them any more culturally Greek as a whole than me having an Italian name than growing up in the middle of Illinois in a cornfield area. Like, we're not going to have the same level of cultural engagement, and my identity could be completely different. Same thing with another great way she put it was, just because someone possesses a Japanese designer bag does not necessarily make them Japanese. It just makes them either they like Japanese culture, or perhaps they just like a bag they just happen to get a bag that was Japanese. So that has often dictated the way I look at interactions between different cultures, be it Greek and non-Greek, and non-Greek and non-Greek, and seeing how there are possible manifestations of identity in the ancient world, and not just taking it at face value, as it were. And then perhaps another last one is that of Arthur Eckstein, which is more of the political framework, broad perspective. In much of traditional narratives around the rise of the Roman Empire or Roman Republic, then becomes the Roman Empire, Rome is oftentimes seen as, for many years, the pinnacle of being the neighborhood bully, or at least the exceptionally violent and bellicose power that rolled over the Greek city-states and kingdoms like a tidal wave, and behaved so outrageously that there was no way that the other powers could have stopped them. But Arthur Eckstein introduced some concepts like political realism and nature of bipolar and unipolar states and settings. But communicate most powerfully, I think, is to contextualize the Romans in that of the Mediterranean world. So reframing it as not the big bad Romans coming in, but the big bad Romans among they're the neighborhood bullies in a school of neighborhood bullies where everybody's exceptionally bellicose and competitive and imperialistic, where it is more complex than just a one-sided domination of imperial power. It's other actors and with agency and drive and aggression that does better you better understand how the Roman conquest happened, or as Polybius, the Hellenistic historian, explains how the Romans conquered the Mediterranean in under 50 years. Those I think are some of the biggest examples of influence I find with scholars, and I always pull other bits of information as time goes on. But in terms of podcasting, Mike Duncan is probably my biggest in terms of my influence and style and presentation manner. I wouldn't be doing this without him, and I'm sure everybody else that has ever considered a history of X is about thinking the same thing. Otherwise, there was also Robin Pearson, who does the history of Byzantium. Patrick Wyman, who did the Fall of Rome series before his Tides of History one. Patrick, actually, what I found influence from him was he shied away from just sticking to a narrative, but also engaging with other aspects of civilization, of telling a story, by focusing on the economic side, by focusing on these little pockets of a larger story, by covering different geographical areas, not just telling a story from start to finish in a coherent manner, rather, or in a straightforward manner. That's what inspired me to start doing these little digressions on philosophy, on science and technology, on religion. Though I think that helps you get a more complete picture, and I think enriches that podcasting experience versus here's a list of dates, events, and names. Go have fun. This is a way that you can really capture the imagination of your listener and engage them in ways and draw them in further than they may have otherwise considered if they're just hearing about what the kings and queens did and how they killed each other. But yeah, those are my primary podcasting influences, and I try not to listen to many other ancient historians because I try not to unconsciously absorb their mannerisms. I already have enough weird quirks as it is. I don't need to start saying things in a certain way, but inevitably I will never escape Mike or Patrick in the way they have shaped podcasting as a medium.
If you could pick one of the lost histories that it's found in Pompeii or Herculaneum, preserved in those. Obviously, it's probably not going to happen. That's not how records get stored and survived and so on, to all of our listeners who are not familiar with that. But just if by a re-roll of the historical dice, you could have one account that we know existed but doesn't survive either in totality, or we have one excerpt from it, what would you pick?
There are two answers to this. One is the writer or the historical podcaster in me who would love it. And that answer would be for that one perspective is the rest of Polybius's histories that we're missing. We do have a lot of it preserved by other authors, such as Titus Livy, most famously, but also some other ones that are quoted through Josephus or Diodorus of Sicily. But just by virtue of the fact that he is the most astute and technically minded historian. He is what Xenophon is to classical Greek history, Polybius is to Hellenistic history, and what Procopius is to late antiquity. We are very much poorer, missing his outside of his first few books. And those first few books we have, and the fragments, have produced enormous amounts of discussion because he was an eyewitness to many of these events. He really did understand the political framework of his time. He was not without bias, I'm not saying that, but he certainly was far more competent of a historian and more self-aware than perhaps many of his counterparts are. But in terms of pure interest, one lost history I find that would be exceptionally fascinating is Apollodorus of Artemisia's the Parthica. Apollodorus is a Greek living in at the time was in Babylonia in Iraq, modern Iraq, under the rule of the Parthian Empire, the descendants of the Horse peoples of the steppe who moved and migrated into the Hellenistic world in the mid-3rd century, eventually established themselves as Rome's great imperial rival and ruled much of the Iranian plateau for about 400 years. Apollodorus, his work is largely lost except for a few fragments. It would have been fascinating for a number of reasons. One, we then have a writing from a Greek living in Babylonia under a non-Greek or non-Roman power who had access to many city archives. And what he wrote about was a wide variety of subjects, not only the history of the Parthians, which Parthia is an often a neglected entity within the framework of the classical period, but he also delves into the history of the Indo-Greeks and Greco-Bactrians. We have numerous references about his observations. He clearly had wrote them as part of the history of the Parthians, because the Parthians would later encounter and fight with them. And he probably had a better eyewitness account of those set events. So what we would gain is a wide variety of detail about the Hellenistic and Parthian Middle East and Central Asia, whereas most of our sources on this is entirely based on coins. We get only the briefest of hints from writers like Strabo, the geographer, who does quote him a couple of times and references his work. So I feel it is depressing when you read about what he might have covered and the fact that we are missing so much of it, and we're just drawing on the tiniest fragments of information to paint kingdoms that lasted a couple of hundred years, and we only have the written names of a few of them, but then we have the coinage of 40 of them. So anything that could have filled in the gaps would have been really helpful. So I'd say that would be my personal pet lost history to replace. And inevitably there's a million other ones I could think of, but that one sticks in my craw just a little bit.
All right. Well, if there's anything you would like to plug our audience with, obviously you can find the Hellenistic Age podcast on most places where you can get podcasts. I watch it on YouTube, but that's just because of when and how I watch videos. Is there anything else you would like to steer our audience towards?
Definitely check out the main website to go for not only for access to my shows, but also for bibliographies and reading guides, family trees, transcripts. They're all available at HellenisticAgePodcast.wordpress.com, or you could also type HellenisticAgePodcast.com. If you have any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me anytime via the drop-down link or on my social media. I'm on virtually every major platform, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. Feel free to drop me a line. I'm more than happy to point you in the right direction. And if I don't know, then I can find someone else who will. But I really do appreciate you inviting me out to pick my brain and let me just ramble on as I'm wont to do when I'm talking about something that is an absolute joy for me to do and speak about. And hopefully you join me for the ride.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.